1445 and the war with France isn't going too well. It was also in this year that England's Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou, the niece of the French King Charles VII. To secure the marriage, he secretly offered to give up the territory of Maine. The marriage also got Henry a truce, but the peace wouldn't last forever. At home, Henry's court was factional and his lords disagreed on many things, mostly on whether or not to continue the war with France. In the king's faction, which wanted peace, was William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, and Edmund Beaufort, the Earl of Somerset. Opposing them was Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, and Richard of York, who, in a stunning twist of events, was the Duke of York. Due to political manoeuvres, York's military command in France wasn't renewed and he was replaced by Somerset, who was now a duke. Soon after York's return, it became public that Henry had promised Maine away and people were quite upset about it. Gloucester in particular was angry about this and openly spoke out against the king's actions. As a result, Henry had him tried for treason in 1447 and during his arrest he died. So, Gloucester was Henry's uncle, and since Henry had no children was thus the heir to the throne. Since Gloucester was now dead, the next in line was now the Duke of York. To get York out of the picture, Henry had him sent to Ireland. Henry was becoming increasingly unpopular and many nobles blamed Suffolk. Parliament wanted him tried a traitor, but instead Henry exiled him for 5 years. Suffolk left for France, but he was intercepted on the way and beheaded. To make matters worse, a popular revolt broke out in 1450, led by a man called either John or Jack Cade. Cade's rebellion was against the corruption of the nobles and Cade demanded reform. This rebellion was initially successful, taking London, but soon descended into looting and violence before Cade was killed and the rebellion crushed. In the same year, Somerset surrendered Normandy and instead of being punished, was rewarded. York, upon hearing this, decided that he would return to England, raise an army and get rid of the king's terrible advisors, which he did. Two sides had now formed, the Lancastrians led by Somerset and Queen Margaret who backed the king, and the Yorkists led by Richard of York. Tensions remained high for the next couple of years, and in 1452 York was summoned to meet the king, which he believed was a trap. York refused to go and did the only thing he could, rebel by mobilising an army. The king mobilised in response and both looked poised for battle. However, they stood down. York and his supporters were pardoned and many of York's opponents were dismissed from power. The next year, 1453, was a big year in English history. The early months bore good news for Henry. Gascony was secured and Queen Margaret became pregnant. This good news wouldn't last though, since the French would later conquer Gascony, thus winning the 100 Years' War. To make matters more complicated, there was a feud brewing between two powerful northern families, the Percys, headed by the Earl of Northumberland, and the Nevilles, headed by the Earl of Warwick. Somerset sided with Northumberland, and as a result, Warwick allied with York. It was at this point that Henry had a mental breakdown, leaving Margaret in charge. In October, Margaret gave birth to a son, Prince Edward, meaning that York was no longer the heir to the throne. Henry showed no signs of getting better, and in 1454 a regency was established. The two factions vied for power, and Parliament gave the regency to York. York immediately stripped Somerset of his offices and sent Margaret away from court. This period is known as the First Protectorate, and York was actually a good regent, undertaking much needed reform. The king, however, made a recovery in later 1454 and soon after removed York as regent and brought Somerset back. With the Lancastrian faction back in control, the Yorkists feared a backlash and so, rebellion. York was summoned to the king, declined and marched his army south where he was reinforced by Warwick. King Henry raised an army as well and the two met at St Albans. Negotiations broke down between the two sides because at this point everyone hated each other and so battle commenced, beginning the Wars of the Roses. The Battle of St Albans was a Yorkist victory which saw Somerset killed and King Henry captured. York was appointed as the Constable of England, i.e. he was in charge, and Henry soon after became ill again. This began the Second Protectorate, which lasted until 1456 when Henry recovered and again dismissed York. The peace was uneasy and so Henry made sure to give rewards to both factions. Warwick was given the captaincy of Calais but mostly engaged in piracy. Tensions remained high and in 1458 Henry tried to reconcile both sides on what was dubbed the Loveday, where both sides promised to calm down. So both sides, now friends forever, went back to immediately plotting each other's downfalls. Warwick was recalled to London to answer for his piracy and upon his return he got into a fight. Warwick accused the Queen of attempting to kill him and the Queen ordered that Warwick be arrested. Warwick fled to Calais and refused to return. Both sides began to mobilise their armies because at this point, why not? Fighting broke out in 1459 with initial Yorkist success, but later in the same year York and Henry's armies met at Ludford Bridge. The Yorkists were massively outnumbered and their men didn't want to fight the king and so the Yorkists did the only thing they could. Run away. Soon after this a parliament was called, known as the Parliament of the Devils, which condemned the Yorkists as traitors and took their land. In 1460 the Yorkists struck back and Warwick, accompanied by York's son Edward and an army, landed here before marching on London. Many in the south were supporters of the Yorkists and London opened its gates to them without resistance. Not long afterwards Warwick led an army north and met the Lancastrian army at Northampton. The Battle of Northampton was a major Yorkist victory and resulted in the king being captured, again. The Yorkists were now firmly in control, and so York found it safe to return. The reason for his return this time was not to remove the king's favourites from court, but to assert his own claim to the throne. This pretty much appalled everyone, even his allies. A settlement was eventually reached that Henry would remain king and York would be named his heir. Queen Margaret was unhappy that her son had been dispossessed and so sought help from the Scots, who gave her an army. York marched north to confront them, but instead of holding up in a castle and awaiting reinforcements, he met the Lancastrians in battle here at Wakefield. Wakefield was a Lancastrian victory and a major setback for York's ambitions since he was killed there. The claim to the throne now lay with York's eldest son, Edward, who was intent on pursuing it. The Yorkists and Lancastrians clashed several times in early 1461. Edward won a battle here at Mortimer's Cross, which saw him capture one of King Henry's favourites, Owen Tudor, who Edward promptly executed. Warwick was defeated at the Second Battle of St Albans by Margaret's army, and after this Henry VI was found sitting under a tree unharmed. Margaret didn't capitalise on her victory and stayed away from London, mainly because the people there weren't too happy with the idea of an army of Scots led by a French queen entering the city. Edward was able to enter the city though and was warmly welcomed. Soon after this, the Yorkists and the people of London asked him to take the throne, which he did, becoming King Edward IV. Edward took an army and marched north, determined to secure his throne, and he met the Lancastrians here at Towton. The Battle of Towton was fought between 40 and 50,000 men, with about 30,000 being killed, and is the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Edward was victorious, and so both Henry and Margaret fled to Scotland. Edward's early reign was fairly uneventful, but was plagued by the question of his lord's loyalties. In 1464, Lancastrian rebels were defeated at the Battle of Hexham, and things started looking better for Edward. Edward did something that kings aren't supposed to do, marry for love, which is what he did when he tied the knot in secret with a lady called Elizabeth Woodville. Kings were supposed to marry for financial or political reasons, which is why Warwick was negotiating for Edward to marry a relative of the French king. Warwick looked a bit of an idiot when Edward told him, and their relationship soured as the king became more independent. Henry at this point had been hiding in the north of England trying to gather support. He did this until 1465 when he was captured and brought to the Tower of London. By this point Warwick was essentially plotting against the king, who had chosen the Woodvilles over him and prevented marriages between their families. That was until Warwick did it anyway, marrying his daughter to Edward's brother George, the Duke of Clarence, who wanted the throne. A rebellion led by one of Warwick's men broke out in 1469. The rebel army met the kings at the Battle of Edgecote, and the rebels were victorious. Edward was taken prisoner shortly afterwards, and Warwick, knowing he couldn't depose the king, attempted to rule through him. This state of affairs didn't last, and it wasn't long before the nobility of England had started to rally against him. Warwick was forced to release Edward in 1469, but Edward made no attempt to punish Warwick or retaliate. Warwick did lose his influence though, and there was only one person who could help him get some of it back, Henry VI. Some men loyal to Warwick started a rebellion. It was crushed, Warwick was implicated and promptly ran away to seek the aid of the French king, who, by the way, was called Louis. Warwick and Margaret begrudgingly came to an agreement, and Warwick, along with a French army, landed in England in 1470. Many of Edward's lords flocked to the Lancastrians, and so Edward had one honourable option: run away. The Lancastrians then entered London and freed King Henry from the Tower of London, and he was declared king again, but make no mistake, Warwick was in charge. He was extremely unpopular though, since the Lancastrians didn't trust him due to his toppling of Henry, and the Yorkists despised him because of his toppling of Edward, who was at this point in Burgundy. France, with the help of Henry, invaded Burgundy, and so its duke gave Edward a bunch of money to invade England. Edward did this happily and landed in Yorkshire in early 1471, and his invasion culminated in two important battles. The first was the Battle of Barnet, a Yorkist victory in which Warwick was killed. The second one was the Battle of Tewkesbury, another Yorkist victory which importantly included the death of Henry's son, Prince Edward, and the capture of Margaret. Edward IV soon after entered London, and it wasn't long before Henry VI died, probably from a case of the murders. Edward's throne was now secure and the Lancastrians were essentially destroyed. The next decade of Edward's reign was uneventful, but importantly he did bring back stability as well as strengthening the law. He became sick and died in 1483 and was succeeded by his son, the 12-year-old Edward V. Edward wasn't old enough to rule on his own, and so his uncle, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, was appointed as Lord Protector to govern for him. A struggle broke out between Richard and the Woodvilles. Gloucester won, and with the help of some clergymen had Edward V decried as illegitimate, making him the heir. Edward V, who was confined to the Tower of London with his younger brother, was deposed after 3 months, and Richard was crowned Richard III. It wasn't long into Richard's reign when a significant rebellion broke out, led by the Duke of Buckingham and Henry Tudor. Richard defeated Buckingham since Henry, who was in Brittany, was prevented from reinforcing. Henry ended up in Paris, where he was given an army to invade, which he did in 1485. Henry marched inland and met Richard's larger army at the Battle of Bosworth Field. It was here that Richard was killed, ending the Yorkist dynasty and allowing Henry Tudor, the half-nephew of Henry VI, to take the throne. Henry was crowned Henry VII and married the daughter of Edward IV, thus uniting the claims of both houses of Lancaster and York into that of one house, the House of Tudor.
I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some book recommendations in the description below if you'd like to know more.